Hi, Sepp hier. Herzlich willkommen zu Vorpolitisch, dem Podcast rund um Gesellschaft, Philosophie und Sozialem. Hier bekommt ihr Shorts zu aktuellen Themen aus einem frischen Blickwinkel serviert. Hello everybody to a new episode of Vorpolitisch Meets, today with Alex Bellamy from the University of Queensland, Australia. Hey Alex.
Hey, how you doing?
Good. Would you like to introduce yourself to the audience so that they know who they're listening to?
Yeah, so my name's Alex Bellamy. I'm Professor of Politics at the University of Queensland in Brisbane, Australia. Originally from the UK, I moved out here 25 years ago and now a true blue Aussie.
That's funny that you're saying that. I was talking to Tim Lynch from the University of Melbourne. I'm not sure if you know him. He's also UK moved to Australia. Wasn't aware of that. Anyway, we've met to talk. Yeah. So we've met to talk about Australian politics, which is one of the things you're teaching. And I don't know if you're aware, we recently had a election in Germany. We're still waiting to get a new chancellor. That will happen quite soonish. And as I came over here, the election was announced. So can you tell our audience a little bit about what kind of political system does Australia have? Like, who's your head of state? Do you have a parliament? How does it work? What are the main political parties and basic stuff?
Yes, certainly. So Australia's political system is a bit of a hybrid, a little bit British and a little bit American. So the British element is we have basically a Westminster Parliament. So our lower house is elected in much the same way as Westminster in the UK. So we have 151 national constituencies, and each of those constituencies has an election. Our system isn't first past the post. We have a preferential system. So you number your preferences for your candidates, and then the preferences of excluded candidates are taken into account. So you get a lot of preference sharing, particularly between the Labour Party and the Green Party, and between the Liberal Party, who are our conservatives. A uniquely Australian thing, our conservatives are called Liberals. And the National Party, but I can go into that in a bit more depth if you like. So we've got that. That's where, like in the Westminster system, government is formed and laws start in our lower house, the House of Representatives, and that's the main deal. The American side is that we're also a federal state. So we've got an upper house, which is our Senate, and that's the House of the States. And that is, each state has 12 seats, and each state is sort of considered a separate electorate. And so the voting system in the Senate is more of a proportional representation system with optional preferences. But each state is considered its own unit. So the other thing about the Senate is a Senate term lasts for 3 years, while a parliamentary term in Australia lasts only 3. Let me wipe that out. A Senate term lasts for 6 years. And the idea being these longer terms allow the Senate to be more deliberative. And in each election, we re-elect half of the Senate. So our national elections are every 3 years. So we have a full election for the House of Representatives every 3 years, which is, I think, one of the shortest election cycles in the world. And we re-elect half of the Senate every 3 years because the Senate term is for 6 years. So what usually happens is the main swings we see are in the lower house. And then in the Senate, we tend to see less dramatic changes to the core of seats. So the main parties usually get the same number of seats, give or take a few. But then you'll get minor parties getting 1, 2, or 3 of the seats in the upper house. And by tradition, Australia very rarely has a majority party in the Senate. So it's very rare for one party to hold a majority in the Senate. Much more common is for 1 or 2 parties to hold the balance of power in the Senate. At the moment, it's the Green Party holds the balance of power in the Senate. And that's usually the case. And historically, whenever a majority has emerged in the Senate, Australians usually correct that fairly quickly at the next election. So that's the other 2 things about our electoral system is we have compulsory voting. So all Australians are required to vote. And coming from the UK, I thought this was a deep affront to the freedom not to vote. But as I've been here and studied Australian politics, I've become a big advocate of compulsory voting. What it means is that the turnout to an average Australian election is above 91%. So it means that everyone's voice is getting heard. And what's really interesting, you'd assume that because people are obliged to vote, well, sort of obliged, like the fine is tiny. It's $50 right now. It used to be $20. So the level of punishment is really small, yet it gets these huge turnouts, 91%. What's interesting is you would assume, and I assumed, that because a lot of people would begrudge going to vote if they didn't want to, they'd, draw pictures on their ballot sheets and what they call in Australia donkey voting. That is where, you write in Mickey Mouse and vote for Mickey Mouse. But actually, the rate of donkey voting in Australia is lower than in the UK and the US. So it's surprising. Right? So in America, people who don't have to vote do go and vote and are more likely to donkey vote than in Australia, where they're obliged to vote. So most Australians, and I think this says something to our political culture, most Australians see voting as a duty of citizenship. And even if they never think about politics for the rest of the time, for the 10 minutes when they're going to vote, they think about politics and they want to have their voice heard or their preferences expressed. So those are the sort of the unique things about Australian politics and Australian elections. And now, in terms of the main parties and players, do you want me to go through the main parties and players?
Yeah, in a second. But first, you have to mention the democracy sausage.
The democracy sausage. It's absolutely crucial. In fact, we've got a podcast. One of our main political podcasts down here is called the Democracy Sausage. So another thing about Australia that's a bit different to the US and the UK is our elections are on Saturdays. And that was because it was a deliberate choice, which is because we want to make it as easy as possible for people to vote. So Australia has also pioneered not just weekend voting, but also early voting. So you can vote for 2 weeks before the election day, postal voting. There's an ethos of trying to make it as easy as possible for people to vote. Now, the effect of that is that election day becomes a bit of a carnival. It's the one day in the year when most Australians are going to go and do the same thing. So because a lot of polling booths are at schools and community centres, the people who run those things kind of saw an opportunity to make a bit of money, do a bit of fundraising. So they'd have stalls, barbecues, and the democracy sausage. So you go and you vote, and after you've voted, you buy a democracy sausage, and a bit of white bread, and that's your democratic duties done. And of course, one of the key tests of someone's suitability to run for high office in Australia is how well they eat the democracy sausage. In 2019, all the polls were predicting a Labor victory. And right until the Labour leader at the time, Bill Shorten, got his democracy sausage and ate it in the wrong way. He ate it from the side rather than from the top of the sausage. And this demonstrated that he was not an authentic kind of working class Labour leader, and his credibility was shot through because of his failure to eat the sausage properly.
That sounds a lot like the US, where they have this big discussion whether you should eat pizza with a fork or not.
Totally, absolutely. The things we get focused on, right?
That's the true core of politics: sausages and pizza. But yeah, so you already mentioned it. Like, can you run us through your main parties? And as you already said, the Liberals, or they're called the Liberals, are actually your Conservative Party. So American listeners might get confused. German listeners won't know what the hell is going on. Yeah, can you run us through them, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So currently our government is the Australian Labor Party, headed by Anthony Albanese. And that's very much like the British Labor Party and the German Social Democrats. The Australian Labor Party comes out of the trade union movement. It was the political wing of the trade union movement. In Australia, like as is one of the first, so the Labor Party was also the very first political party in Australia. In my home state of Queensland was the first place on the planet to have a Labor government. And that's because the working class movement was always very strong from the very early days of Australian settlement. And the kind of the propertied classes, because the colonies were so small, the propertied classes depended on the white working class. There was always a strong racial element to it, of course, but they depended on the white working class. So this meant that the trade union movement was a lot stronger, a lot earlier in Australia than in other parts of the world. So ALP now would be sort of centre left. and has been governing for the last 3 years, and that's Anthony Albanese. The opposition party, oddly called a Liberal Party, they're basically conservative. But there's two wings to the Liberal Party. There is a small L liberal wing, which is more socially progressive, wanting to move on things like climate change. Think sort of with the British parallel, sort of a David Cameron sort of conservative. But then there's a harder right-wing conservative that is anti-immigration, anti-action on climate change. And in the Liberal Party, there's been a kind of internal struggle for the soul of the party for the last kind of couple of decades. Now, why they call the Liberal Party goes back to their foundation in the end of the Second World War, where they were sort of formed as an amalgamation of all the anti-socialist parties. So most of which at some point had been branch-offs from the Labour Party. So you had lots of parties that were kind of in the centre and on the right, who simply defined themselves as being anti-socialist. They were free traders, they were protectionists, they were parties interested in kind of rural politics, and they were sort of old-fashioned small L liberals, those who wanted to, free trade, small governments, but pro-political and human rights, that sort of thing. So this party has drifted to the right in the last kind of decade or two, both in terms of its policies, but also its personnel. So one of the things that happened at the last election in 2022 was in a lot of the wealthiest seats in places like inner city Sydney, Liberal candidates were challenged by independents. So what we call in Australia the teals. And these are people who were themselves fairly wealthy. Their economics was largely small L liberal, but they'd become disillusioned with this party because they thought it wasn't moving fast enough on things like climate change, on things like gender equality. So these were like the traditional, poor, wealthy conservative seats. And at the last election, 7 of them pivoted from the Liberal Party to the Teals, which was critical in getting Albanese into government. Now, those MPs that were rejected were themselves the small L, more centrist members of that party. So the main people in that party that were opposed to the right of that party lost their seats, and this contributed to the rightwards drift of the Liberal Party. Now, to add more confusion, our Liberal Party are in a long-term alliance with another party called the National Party, which is a sort of the party of the countryside. And the National Party has itself become more conservative. So the National Party these days is the bastion of anti-climate politics. One of their cornerstone policies is they want our energy future to be based on nuclear energy. And so they've sort of helped also drag the Liberal Party to the right. Why it's confusing is that in most states in Australia, you have both Liberals and Nationals, and they're in some seats you will have Liberals running against Nationals. In other seats, you might only have a Liberal or a National. Now, the struggles between those two parties became so severe that in Queensland, they decided to put aside the coalition and just form a single party, the Liberal National Party. So when you look at the national figures for an election in Australia, you will get a national vote for the Liberals, you'll get a national vote for the Nationals, and you'll get this other thing for the LNP, which are the Liberals and Nationals in Australia. And then the other force on the left is the Green Party. And the Greens have gone from being a small fringe to being now a major political party. They've got 4 seats here in Brisbane. So my own constituency now has a Green MP in the lower house. The Greens hold the balance of power in the Senate and have done for most of the last 15, 20 years. Their politics is obviously based on kind of an ecologist approach to politics. So they want stronger action on climate change. They're also further to the left of the Labor on most social issues, on things like, for example, housing relief, extending Medicare and that sort of thing. And the Greens have gotten progressively stronger. And there's two reasons for that. One is the Greens are most popular amongst young voters, and the more young voters are coming of age to be able to vote. So they're voting, and they're voting for the Greens. And the other is because Labour has to try to appeal to two different constituencies of core Labour voters. You've got urban progressives who want more action on climate change, for example, but you've got traditional blue-collar industry workers, union members, who are more interested in jobs, and a lot of whom in Australia work in the mining sector. So you've got a real tension that Labour has to try and balance. And as Labour in particular is seen as moving too slowly on things like climate, so urban progressives and the younger, more educated people have pivoted to the Greens. Now, our preferential voting system means that Labour and Green votes pass between them. So most people who vote Greens will vote Labour as their second preference. So those votes very often will end up with Labour. Similarly, most people who vote Labour will have Green as their second preference. So in my constituency, for example, on first preferences, the Liberals win the highest number of first votes. The second highest are the Greens, the third highest are Labour. But because Labour preferences flow to the Greens, when the Labour candidate gets excluded, about 90% of those preferences go to the Greens, and that puts the Greens in first place. And so the Greens win the electorate. The other two phenomena, one that I've already mentioned, are the rise of independents. So public faith in the major parties has declined election on election, and more people are voting for independents, including these teal independents who are fairly centrist, but also more kind of extravagant and extremist independents. And then the other, which is part of that, is the One Nation Party, which is the sort of our hard right party, associated with Pauline Hanson from Ipswich, just down the road from where I am. And their polling kind of rises and falls, often depending on what the other Conservative parties are doing. At the moment, they seem to be polling quite well, particularly in the Senate. There's evidence that in some states they're picking up 10 to 15% support, which could give them some more Senate seats. They likely won't get any seats in the lower house, just because of the way our voting system works. Makes it hard for small parties to get elected in the lower house. But it's likely that One Nation will pick up one or two more seats in the Senate.
And there's another quite interesting figure that you have in politics here. Maybe you can say a word or two who Clive Palmer is.
Clive Palmer. Well, so he is another Queenslander, was Queenslanders. So he's a billionaire. Quite how many billions he has differs depending on what day it is and how you count. And he used to be associated with the Liberal Party here in Queensland, and they had falling out. I think largely a falling out over Clive Palmer is a Trumpist sort of character. So he's not someone who wants to be part of a party that isn't named after him, right? And so I think the falling out was more one of personality than policy necessarily. He then ran, he had his own party, the Palmer United Party. He himself got elected to Senate a few years ago, but I don't think he enjoyed, there's lots of hours of sitting in committees. There were lots of photographs of him sitting in the Senate after a long lunch, fast asleep. Anyway, he lost his Senate seat. And each election, he spends an inordinate amount of money. So in the 2019 election, for example, his advertising spend was $80 million. And for that, he got nobody elected. Similarly, this year, he's bought himself a new political party called the Trumpet of Patriots, which is a party that existed before. And it's a bizarre name. Trumpet of Patriots. It's the weirdest name. And the story's weird as well. So this was a party that existed. It ran candidates at the last election, about 60 candidates, who between them, I think, got about 100 votes. And Palmer just bought the party. So he's again spending tens of millions of dollars on advertising. But the interesting thing is he's spending a vast amount of money, but there's no party organization, there's no party structure. but there's nothing behind the advertising spend, nothing that indicates that he actually wants to get people elected. In fact, his party platform is quite literally cut and paste from his last party's platform 3 years ago. Literally the same write-up is there this year. So you've got this guy who's spending tens of millions of dollars on advertising, but there's no ground campaign, there's no party infrastructure, there's nothing that indicates that this is going to be a serious party. Now, he was asked about this at the press club a few weeks ago. A journalist said to him, what's going on? You're spending all of this money, you're getting no political return, nobody's getting elected. What's this all about? And he said, I'm a billionaire and I don't like playing golf, but I do like getting involved in elections. So this for me is like playing golf. It's something I just do for a hobby because it's fun, which is just bizarre. Now, there is not sinister side, but there is a side to this. So, for example, in the 2019 election that I mentioned earlier, where everybody expected that Labour would win, the bulk of that $80 million advertising spend was a negative campaign against the Labour leader. So what he brought to the party was this huge negative advertising campaign, not to win himself votes, but that won votes for the Liberals that they might not ordinarily have gotten. The other thing is preference harvesting. That is, the way the preferencing system works, people who just want to protest, those are the sorts of people that might vote for the Trumpet of Patriots. But the way the preferencing works is if you cast your protest vote for the Trumpet of Patriots, through their preferencing, it's likely to end up back with the Liberals. So even a small party like Clive Palmer winning a fairly small number of votes can nonetheless deliver extra votes to the Liberals that they wouldn't ordinarily get through the preferencing system. But yeah, Clive Palmer is, and he's there again, and you can't click on anything on YouTube right now in Australia without getting a Clive Palmer Trumpet of Patriots advert. And one of my confident predictions is that they will end up with 0 seats in the lower house. I suspect 0 seats in the Senate as well. But you never know. They might pick up 1 seat in the Senate, but I doubt that.
Yeah, I've noticed that as well. I've been just over at the West Coast doing a bit of a road trip, and you go up and down the coast, and there's Trumpet of Patriots posters everywhere, and yeah, as you said, massive spend on advertising. But you've mentioned the preferential voting system a couple of times. Maybe we need to go into a little more detail what that means and how it works. So there's a list of names: Labor, Greens, Liberals, and so on. And then I just put 1, 2, 3 as in which order I want them, or how does it work?
That's right. Yes. So you get a ballot sheet with a list of names, and you have to number each of the boxes. You have to put a number against each candidate, and you put them in your order of preference: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So what they do then with counting. So the first thing they count are all the number 1 preferences. So they'll count those first, and so you've got a tally of everyone's first preference. The whole idea is based on what we call the majoritarian principle. That is, you get elected if you get 50% plus 1 of the vote. Now, usually after that first preference, but there are some seats where on first preference, the local MP is so popular they get more than 50% of first preferences, so they're just elected. If anyone's got 50% plus 1, they're elected straight away. Now, usually, almost always, that's not the case. So what do you do then? You then look at who came last, and you exclude them from the vote, and then you look at their preferences, and you give, so who voted for the Trumpet of Patriots, who did they put as their number 2? And then you assign those votes and see, does anyone now get to 50% plus 1? Usually when you're down at the bottom, the answer is no, and you keep doing that process, excluding a candidate, looking at their preferences. Does anyone get to 50% plus 1 until somebody does get to 50% plus 1 and that person gets elected? So each seat, the dynamic is slightly different, and it can make a big difference. Who finishes second or third makes a big difference, because that determines whose preferences are getting counted.
Gefällt euch Vorpolitisch? Gefällt euch Vorpolitisch genug, um den Podcast aktiv zu unterstützen? Wenn ja, dann könnt ihr mir über die Coffee-App einen virtuellen Kaffee ausgeben. Einfach auf ko-fi.com/vorpolitisch gehen und spenden. Das ist ko-fi.com/vorpolitisch. Für jede Unterstützung jetzt schon. Vielen herzlichen Dank. Okay, so yeah, that's interesting because the order in which people drop out at the bottom would make a difference to how they're tallied up at the top. But it also makes sure that every vote is counted. Now, you've mentioned the number of seats before. That was how many again?
It is 151, I think, off the top of my head.
Okay, and each one is counted separately, like it is. It is in the
each seat is counted separately. So we usually have a long election night because, particularly with like an election like this, because the seats in Western Australia, the polling there closes quite late, and so the voting there and the counting there happens quite late. So we don't usually get a sense of what's happening in Western Australia till quite late in the evening. But yeah, each seat is counted separately in the seat itself.
Yeah, just for the German listening, so the time difference between Perth and Brisbane, East Coast, West Coast, is 2 hours, right?
Yeah, that's right.
So, as the election is coming up, who are the two main candidates? Mr. Potato Head, who's that?
I don't know who you'd possibly mean. Of course, I will maintain complete impartiality all the way through. So we've got our Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese. He is from the left of the Australian Labor Party. He's from a working class background, brought up by a single parent, was involved in the union movement and has been a kind of Labor activist most of his life, and a long-standing and highly respected parliamentarian. So under previous Liberal governments, he was often opposition manager of business, and so had some fairly close relationships with members of the Liberal Party. And the one of the things he's known for is for being extremely friendly. He talks about kindness as being his kind of key virtue. But I think one story kind of conveys, sometimes what goes on behind the scenes in Australian politics, where it's sometimes not all about rough and tumble. So on the Liberal side of politics is a former tennis superstar called John Alexander. And you may remember a few years ago, Australia went through this phase of getting rid of prime ministers quite quickly. We got through a few of them. They lost party support, and this was there was a particular day when a former prime minister for the Liberal Party called Tony Abbott his leadership was in question, but nothing was happening. There was no immediate vote, but everyone thought there was going to be a vote within a few hours or so. And so John Alexander from the Liberal Party got together with his friend Anthony Albanese from the Labour Party and went off and played tennis for a few hours whilst this political drama was. So that gives you a sense of the sort of person Albanese is, right? He's friendly, he's kind, he reaches out across, and he's really, really well respected. I mentioned the 2019 election a little while ago, and this was a kind of a pivotal election in Australia, not just because everyone expected that the ALP would win, the Labour Party would win, and they didn't, but because at that election, the Labour Party's manifesto or political program was really quite radical by Australian standards. It was a sort of radical social democratic agenda. They were talking about increasing taxes on mining companies and wealthier people, redistributing wealth, investing heavily in social support services. So the fact that they lost an election they expected to win with an expansive political agenda meant that after that, they've narrowed down their political agenda. So although Albanese comes from the left of the Labour Party, he's very much a centrist in terms of how he's governing and in terms of the policies he's bringing to this election. And that's very much a result of what happened in 2019. On the other side, you have Mr. Potato Head, Peter Dutton is the leader of the Liberal Party. And Dutton is the torchbearer of the right in the Liberal Party. So of a party that's moved progressively rightwards in the last sort of decade or so, he is the the leader of that right faction. And he was elected unopposed when Albanese won the last election in 2022. Dutton was elected unopposed. And part of the reason for that was, as I mentioned, because the Liberals lost so many seats to these teal independents, there are no longer senior centrist or moderate Liberals in the party. They all lost their seats in 2022. So if you like, the party has kind of moved to the right and is trying to bank on the idea that it can kind of win enough support amongst the kind of the angry suburbs to carry them to victory.
Yeah, he's an ex-copper. He's also from Queensland, right?
He is. These Queenslanders so keep popping up, don't they? He is. So Queensland is known as being, you know, one or if not the most conservative state. Right now, most of our federal seats are held by Liberals. There is no expectation that they're going to lose any of those seats. Though paradoxically, you know, we talked about Australia being a federal state. So federally, Queensland leans very much towards the Liberals. But at the state level, our state government is currently Liberal. But for most of the time in the last 20 years, it's been Labor. So in the time that I've lived here in Queensland, I've only had one term of a Liberal government plus the current Liberal. So that's 4 years of Liberal government and 17 years of Labor government. So there's an interesting divide between how people vote in state politics and how they vote in federal politics.
So as we're recording this, the election has not happened. By the time I will be releasing this, the election will have happened. So now I'm putting you on the spot. Who do you think is going to carry the election and why?
So I'm going to hedge my bets, and I'm going to say I think no party will have an overall majority. There you go.
Okay. But who's your next prime minister?
I think that it's more likely that Anthony Albanese will form government. So I think it's likely that the Liberals will gain some seats. So the Liberals currently sit on 59 seats. To get a majority, they need 76 seats. I can see almost no way in which they get that number of seats. So I think they'll take some seats, but not enough to form majority government, and probably not enough to be able to cobble together a coalition to form government. So I suspect that we'll have a minority government, and that will be led by Albanese, and will probably involve maybe not a formal coalition with the Greens, but an agreement around what we call in Australia, agreement around confidence and supply. So that is, you don't have a formal coalition, but the Greens say, we will, if there's a vote of confidence in the House, in the government, we'll vote with the government. And also on budget bills, so money bills, we'll vote with the government so that the government can continue paying the bills. So that's what they call a confidence and supply agreement. And I think that's likely to be the most likely outcome. Because I think the Greens will probably hold the seats that they've got at the moment. They might lose one or two. I think the Liberals will gain some seats from Labor. There's some marginal seats that I think they will gain from Labor. I think they might win one or two of the seats back from the Teals. But I think at the outer stretch, I could see them winning 10 seats overall, which is nowhere near the number of seats they need to form government. So that's my guess. But you know, I'm usually wrong. And the polls have been, you know, the polls, like 2019, the polls got it completely wrong. And this is the election that haunts Labor, because right up to the election, the polls were saying Labor are going to win. Now, what they've done this time is really interesting. Is if you asked me that question in February, I would have said Peter Dutton's going to win. Because in January, February, and for the year before that, the Liberals had a very strong lead in the polls. And you couldn't see a way in which Labor would be able to hold on to enough seats to form government. Since February, that's changed dramatically. And I think it's changed for two reasons.
One, let me guess. One of them is in the US?
Bingo. So that's the one that has really, I think it was changing before Trump. Well, changing before the effects of Trump came in. And I think that change was because, and here I'm going to refer to Tony Blair. So Tony Blair was once asked, why is it that polls often get things wrong, and why is it that incumbent governments often end up doing better in elections than the polls were suggesting? And Blair's response was, because if you do opinion polls between elections, what people are doing is they're comparing the government they actually have with some fictional other idea sort of government. And they go, well, our government's not very good, inflation's gone up and, the buses are late. So this other government that I don't know anything about, I don't know who the opposition are, they must be better, so I'll vote for them. But when you get closer to an election, what people do is they look at the government they actually have and the possible other government they actually have. So they start scrutinizing Peter Dutton in a way they haven't scrutinized him before. And when they start to dig away at, well, who is this guy that wants to be prime minister? They go, ooh, I don't like him very much. And of course, that's been Labour's strategy, right? As soon as the election was called, all the attention was on Peter Dutton and, his past statements and things. So I think that was one reason that started to shift it. Then the other, as you said, is definitely the Trump effect. And Trump's had a really profound effect on this election in that it's not just changed how people are thinking about voting. I think it's changed what this election is actually about. At the start of the cycle, this was a cost of living election. It was all about, inflation. And in that election, like with the election in Germany, like in the UK, like in the States, incumbency was a problem because, we've got a global inflation crisis. If you're the incumbent government, you get blamed for it. So being the incumbent is hard. Trump's come along and he's changed the place of incumbency. This is now no longer an election about the cost of living. It's no longer a backwards-looking election about inflation. It's now a forwards-looking election about who do we think is best placed to keep us stable amidst the turmoil of Trump. So people are now looking forward and they go, well, we've got Albanese, the guy who's kind of kept it stable for the last few years, or we've got Dutton, this guy that we're a bit worried about and hasn't run government. And last time he was in government, we didn't really like what we want, what he did. Plus, you've got what do with these two sets of leaders, how do they relate to Trump? So, this has been a real problem for Dutton. Dutton started the election cycle saying, we're going to cut 40,000 public service jobs in Canberra. And 6 months ago, this was hugely popular. Everyone hates civil servants. So, yeah, let's sack civil servants. But then they saw Elon Musk and they saw Doge. And suddenly that policy became really, really unpopular. And Dutton had to ditch it. And there's a whole lot of other sort of Trumpist sort of policies that looked popular 6 months ago, but Australians just don't like, and they don't like anything that looks like Trump. And so, in effect, Trump has fundamentally shifted. He's like the third player in the election. And like in Canada, he shifted it away from the conservative side of politics towards the non-conservative, because Australians just don't like all that culture war stuff. They don't like the Trump stuff. The thing about Australian politics, it is a bit boring, and most Australians are kind of happy with it being boring. And a lot of it doesn't make sense, but they're like, it works all right. Classic example is, the referendum we had in '99 on the Republic. You mentioned earlier, who's the head of state there? Well, our head of state is King Charles III of the UK. And you go, well, how could that be? And well, we had a referendum. And most Australians were like, yeah, let's keep the monarchy. And that's not because they love the monarchy. Most of them would like happily get rid of King Charles. But it's like, the political system kind of works. It's kind of all right. Why would you muck around with it? Why would you change it? And so it's that sort of Australian view. It's like, a 3-year elections. Australians are obliged to vote. They don't like voting, but they prefer to have elections every 3 years because the one thing they don't like more than voting is politicians. So the idea that a politician might want a term beyond 3 years makes them a bit suspicious. What are you trying to cover up? But then you've got this other thing where we have these 3-year terms, but with only one exception in Australian political history, federal governments always get 2 terms. So only once in our history has a first-term government been ejected at the next term. So you've got all these kind of weird and wonderful paradoxes, which I think the root of it is, we don't really like we don't really like our politicians very much, but we do like the state, and we do like the state organizing things for us. Australians are very happy to be organized. They like bureaucracies. They like things to be ordered. And so, you know, having lots of elections and being compelled to vote, that's okay.
Yeah, and you know, as a German speaking, you know, we like our red tape as well.
Yeah, there's something I didn't when I moved to the image of Australia I had when I moved here was, you know, Sydney Olympics. It's all free and open, but actually it's much more heavily regulated, and it's very clear in our political system. And you compare it with, say, the US system. Like, we have a very powerful independent election board that, you know, it draws all the boundaries in a non-political way. It organizes the elections, and we're all happy with it. We don't want politicians getting involved in writing election rules or writing election boundaries, or we want bureaucrats doing that because we think that'll produce a fairer game. So we're kind of comfortable with that. Yeah. But if you ask an Australian whether they like red tape, they'll say, no, we hate red tape.
Of course they would say that. So one thing that, you know, we've seen all over Europe, and even like also in the last German election, is that, you know, the populist right wing is gaining ground, as it did in the US. It's gaining ground everywhere in Europe. Is that something you're seeing in Australia as well?
That's a great question, and the answer depends on who you ask and what you look at. So we have our populist right wing parties, so One Nation, Trumpet of Patriots, and they will get somewhere between 8 and 15, 16% of the vote. That's not necessarily greater than it has been in the past. So One Nation came onto the scene in the early 1990s. And if you sort of track their votes, what it tends to do is kind of rise and fall. You don't, whereas with the Greens, you've had a kind of a sustained and gradual increase. With the radical right parties, it's much more erratic. So there might be moments where you have a particular election where there's a strong protest vote, and there might be other elections where there isn't. And that's often to do with sentiment about who's the Liberal leader at the time. So if the Liberal leader is seen as being fairly to the right, it's often that protest vote is going to be smaller. If they are more to the centre, it tends to creep up. So it's a phenomenon that's there. It appears to be increasing in as much as the noise gets bigger, but whether the noise gets bigger because of social media and the rest, or because there's more support, is unclear. They will pick up votes and they will get some seats. Our system means that extreme parties find it very difficult to win seats because you've got to win preferences, and the preferences mean you know, you've got to do deals with others to have those preference flows. One political historian explained the preference system as this kind of, again, beautifully Australian thing where the 50% plus one rule means that it's not the most popular candidate that gets elected, it's the least disliked, because the least disliked is the one that gets all the other preferences. And so this makes it really hard for extremists to convert votes into seats. So polling suggests that One Nation in some places might do quite well, and they might pick up some Senate seats. Does that mean there's a rise of populism? It's hard to say. I think you don't have this. I think one thing this election has made clear is you don't have a mainstream drift as you've seen in the States. So what's become very clear in the last few weeks with the Trump phenomenon is that mainstream centrist and centre-right voters do not like that sort of politics. And it's been a problem for Peter Dutton, right? Any association with Trumpist-like politics has been a problem with him. And that's because of our compulsory voting system, right? Because the bulk of your voters are not people who are politically engaged. These are people spending their lives doing much more interesting things, and they'll spend 5 minutes thinking about voting when they come to vote, and they think, well, who's the safest pair of hands? And a Trumpist-like candidate is not the safe pair of hands, right? So the effect of this is to drive it to the center, which some people think is a problem because it means that you don't get bold ideas and radical initiatives, and other people say is a strength because it means that our governments really do reflect the will of the majority, and it's the majority of everyone, not just of those who are motivated to go and vote. And often that majority, they want more centrist, more sensible sorts of politics. So I don't think you're getting a big drift off to populism. But each of the major parties has problems that it's, in terms of thinking about the future, problems on its wings. So for the Labour Party, the Greens are getting more popular amongst young voters, and they're getting more popular because young voters think that Labour aren't radical enough on things like climate change and social justice. So but if Labour becomes more radical, it risks losing support in the centre. So is the future some sort of Labour Green coalition, a bit like the Liberal National coalition? You stitch those two together and you start to be polling, in the high 40s, 50s. And then on the right, Peter Dutton has the same issue. The further he goes to the right, the more he loses his centre. And the question is, do you lose more votes in the centre than you're gaining from the right? And this is a huge debate in the Liberal Party right now. So Liberals from kind of those classic Liberal seats, those wealthy areas that went teal, so they'll argue that the Liberals can't get back to government without getting back those core seats. But those core seats are, yes, they're wealthy, but they're more progressive. They're socially progressive. They're progressive on climate change. They're progressive on gender equality. So the argument within the Liberal Party is that by chasing more votes to the right, they risk losing a greater number of votes in the centre. So for every vote you pick up by moving rightwards, you lose 5 votes in your heartland, and that makes it more difficult for you to win elections. So that, for me, is going to be one of the really interesting things of looking at this election, because Dutton's strategy has basically been, forget about those old seats. Those teal seats are not coming back to the Liberals. What we're going to do is go for targeting the outer suburbs of big cities, so Sydney and Melbourne, traditional Labour sorts of seats, but it's trying to latch onto the Trumpist blue collar phenomena. These people are angry because they're having to pay more for petrol and commute longer distances. So can you convert that anger into votes and win votes by going to the right, if you like? And it's a sort of a Trumpist-like strategy. What's going to be really interesting to see is whether it was always going to be difficult to pull off just because of the number of seats you need. But I think now it's looking even more unlikely that it's going to be delivered. So the question is, when we're looking at the results, is how much did that strategy win or not? Which was a long-winded answer to your question, sorry, which is just about populist parties. But populist parties, they just bounce around. There's one of my great, another kind of figure of Australian politics who every Australian looks to on election night. It's a guy called Anthony Green, and he's the election statistics guy on our broadcasting network. So he's the guy who calls the election and is out with his calculator. And I saw him give a lecture about populist parties in Australia. And he said the one thing that can be guaranteed to kill off a populist party is for them to be elected to something. And he went through a long history of radical parties actually getting elected, actually getting some MPs or getting a senator. And what always happens is when confronted with the challenges of actually governing, they fall apart because all they ever were just kind of protests, right? And so Anthony Green's got this theory that says, well, if you're worried about just wait till they get elected, then they'll fall apart fairly quickly after that. And you can look at the ebb and flow of populism a little like that.
Was that only Australian examples or international?
He was just talking about Australian examples, yeah. So I think that might have something to do with our voting system as well. And I think that also places a dampening. If you think about who is motivated to go and vote, in places where you have voluntary voting, of course, the angry are often those who are more motivated to vote than the complacent, right? So you can expect a larger populist vote in places where you have voluntary voting, whereas in Australia, where everyone's got to vote, if you're complacent, you don't care about politics, but you think everything's trucking along okay, well, you'll go and vote for one of the mainstream parties. You'll pick a number, or you'll go, well, who's my MP at the moment? They seem to be doing okay, and you'll vote for them. So it's an interesting system where what they call the political strategists call low information voters. So these are the people who literally don't know who they're going to vote for until election day and just go, oh, well, they look all right, or they go and cast their vote. And they're often key in Australian elections.
Thanks for that insight. That was very interesting. I think we've mostly covered it. Is there anything you'd like to add?
No. Other than, sorry for talking so fast and getting a bit carried away and off message a few times. But it's the more I've learned about Australian politics, the more I kind of get excited. It's so full of weird and wonderful characters. So we talked about Clive Palmer, but you know the story of Harold Holt. So we had
a prime minister.
Yeah, a prime minister in the 1960s who went for a swim and never came back. And conspiracy theories abound as to what happened he drowned at sea, unfortunately. But, there were lots of conspiracy theories. Had he been picked up by a Chinese submarine? Was he secretly a KGB spy? These are the sorts of things. Or we've got the kind of the prime ministers that like to take cabinet meetings whilst wearing their swim shorts, sitting in a lilo in the middle of a pool. So one of our kind of most famous Australian politicians, leaders, a guy called Bob Hawke. He governed through the 1980s, and he was well known for being mad keen on horse racing. So he would listen to the horse racing during cabinet meetings, but also having meetings with ministers whilst floating in his very skimpy 1970s, 80s style swim shorts, floating on an inflatable lilo in the middle of the swimming pool at the Prime Ministerial residence in Canberra with his briefing notes in his hand, having meetings. So it's full of kind of interesting characters.
Yeah, who was the guy who holds the world record in sculling the yard glass?
That's Bob Hawke. That's the guy. Yeah. And if you go to the pub in Oxford, it's the one that's the oldest. I forget the name of it. The oldest pub in Oxford. There's a plaque still on the wall. So Bob Hawke, Rhodes Scholar, ace beer drinker, and Prime Minister. He won four straight federal elections.
I think German voters would vote for somebody who can scull a beer quickly.
Well, so it didn't really turn my vote. But one thing that would have turned my vote from my local Labour state level part was that I saw a video of her having a sculling competition with Bob Hawke. And she actually sculled a beer quicker than Hawke did, which I thought was just hugely impressive.
Fantastic. On that note, thanks so much for explaining Australian politics to us, Alex.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Hier endet eine weitere Episode von Vorpolitisch, dem Podcast rund um Gesellschaft, Philosophie und Soziale. Vielen Dank für eure Zeit. Und wenn es euch gefallen hat, hört beim nächsten Mal wieder zu und vor allem teilt den Link zu diesem Kanal auf Facebook, Twitter und wo ihr sonst noch unterwegs seid. Warum nicht jetzt sofort? Ich bin Sepp, macht's gut und bis zum nächsten Mal.